Ladies and gentlemen, may I indulge your time for an important matter? At least it is important to me. My name is Thomas Ray and I died on the 12th of December 1879. This is my family plot in the Colac cemetery. For years, many have assumed that I am buried here. I am not. However, I feel my spirit and soul is here in Colac and want you to know this. I was born in 1835 in Dalton, Scotland, the second son of John Ray, the schoolmaster. We lived in the schoolhouse until I went to Edinburgh to study medicine. After my dear mother died, I was attracted by the excitement of life in the colonies and by Victoria in particular. I was aged 22 when I arrived in Batesford near Geelong in 1857, and there were so many travelling the road to Ballarat. Life was very busy. However, I soon heard of the need for a second doctor in Colac to support Dr. Nankerville. For the next 20 years, I was your doctor. When I first laid eyes on Colac, I was struck by the sheer beauty of the countryside, the vast lake that teemed with fish and bird life, the Warrion Hills, the lush Otway Forest and the boundless green pastures stocked with cattle and sheep. The growing township had prospered from the gold rush. Sadly, Dr. Nankerville died in 1859, not long after I had arrived, and in 1861 I married his widow Agnes. Hugh Murray, no less, was a witness. In my later years in Colac, I became the object of gossip and disappointment. I will speak more on this. Over these 20 years, there were too many incidents of great distress to my patients, as well as to myself, to recount. I recall the following as having perhaps the greater claim on my memory. In 1862, when I had been in Colac for about 4 years, there was a most horrific accident in Warrion. The distressing news reached Colac, where I rallied together a convoy of medical assistants. Miraculously, we arrived at the scene of the carnage in just over 2 hours after the accident. I understand Captain Albert Hancock and his workers were watching the threshing of the first oat sheaf of the season, when a devastating blast ripped apart the boiler and steam engine. At lightning speed, steam, superheated water, and metal pieces and parts went flying in all directions over a huge area, horrifically maiming and burning most of the men. As the thick dust settled, the men, who were still able, managed to bring the wounded and dead down to the house. John Bell had died instantly, when part of his skull was fractured in two. Captain Hancock lay in a helpless state, although acutely aware of what just happened. He promptly directed the men to help others before the scalding, wounds and multiple fractures he sustained overcame him and he lapsed into insensibility. Thomas Moran also suffered a fractured skull and lay in a precarious state. We could do nothing for these men. Neither regained consciousness and both died the following day. These events necessitated me, as district coroner, to conduct 2 inquests in the days following the blast. Both juries concluded that all 3 deaths were the result of a terrible accident. No negligence was found. As Colac did not have a hospital, 2 men had already been sent to Geelong by spring wagon, the slow journey taking around 10 hours. With intensive care over time, both men recovered, but like many of the other survivors, they were crippled and maimed for life. The Colac townsfolk rallied magnificently to support the remaining 6 mutilated souls. A women's committee formed a subscription list, and our little town raised £60 to go some way in overcoming the many needs and expenses of our patients. Joseph Turner would urgently need his leg amputated 4 weeks after the event. The attempt to save his life, however, proved in vain, as he died within the hour. I was called on continuously at all hours, for days, for weeks, and then months, as we attempted to alleviate the terrible pain. Often it could only be dulled by the brandy we could dispense. It was heartwarming to see the people of Colac escort the remains of Albert Hancock from Colac on its way to Melbourne, where he was buried in the General Cemetery. The other three men are buried here in the Colac Cemetery, in unmarked graves, we know not where. It seems miraculous now that only 4 men lost their lives in that catastrophic event. The desperate suffering of the survivors, however, remains long in my mind. As I look across the cemetery, I note the memorial to Charles Bayeretz, manager of the National Bank. Charles had been shooting quail near Robertson's at Larpent, when grazier William Woodward, passing by, stopped and beckoned him. As Charles climbed over the fence, his gun accidentally discharged, ripping his left arm apart. Woodward brought him into Colac, and after examination I called for Dr. Reid of Geelong for assistance. In an attempt to save his life, we administered chloroform and amputated the arm, but he died 2 days later. He was just 28 years of age. Friends erected the monument to his memory. It was a great tragedy for Charles's Jewish-born wife, Amelia, whose family had disowned her when she chose to marry outside of her faith and had eloped with Charles barely 5 years earlier. Amelia was inconsolable in her grief. Even though there were 2 small children, she considered suicide, and for a time after his death could be found at his graveside weeping uncontrollably. Believing to have had a sign from God, Amelia later became an evangelist, travelling the world to spread the word of Christ. The community rallied again the following year, giving generously to erect a monument to commemorate the heroic conduct of cousins George and Wallace Smalley, who died in a boating accident on the lake. As the coroner, I found it heart-wrenching listening to the testimony of the survivor, Robert McAfee, who was distraught as he provided a detailed account of what happened. The 3 young men were out shooting from a flat-bottomed dinghy. George and Wallace Smalley. Wallace was a teacher at Irrawulipi, George at Maroon, and Robert McAfee, a teacher at Larpent School. Robert was married and the father of 3 children. When they were 500 yards offshore, a sudden squall saw the boat capsize. McAfee, a non-swimmer, was put in the boat when it was uprighted. The Smalleys were excellent swimmers, and they attempted to push the boat to shore, whilst praying and cooing for assistance, but they became exhausted. Their dog swam beside them, but eventually gave in and drifted away. Robert advised that near the end, George cried out that he would not see his mother again. When 300 yards from shore, George and Wallace could not go on and silently drifted from the boat. Prior to this, Wallace gave his gold watch to Robert to be given to his fiancée. Both men had shed their clothes to help in their efforts, to no avail. Thomas McManus, hearing a local lad calling for help, plunged into the lake and rescued McAfee. There were so many accidents in my time here: drownings, babies scalded in boiling water, explosions and gunshot wounds, people hit by trains and falling from horses, and the suicides. And there were illnesses that tore families apart, taking a parent, or both, or sometimes several of their children. The Harris family were perhaps the most unfortunate souls. Charles was a brewer, and the family had only been in Victoria for a few years. I remember Mrs. Harris had 9 children and was pregnant with another when her 2 oldest boys died of scarlet fever within a day. Then another son died on Christmas Day from his heart. and her baby twin girls failed to thrive and died a few weeks later. The family reduced from 9 children to 4 in a matter of weeks. You will not find a grave or headstone. There was barely enough to bury all those children in such a short time. How much can one family suffer? We lost 2 of our own wee bairns before they were but 1 year of age, from measles and teething, and I could do nothing to save them. The pain and grief that those families suffered, that we suffered. As your doctor, coroner, and justice of the peace, there were many challenges, and I took on more responsibilities as a community member, including serving on countless committees. There were continuous delays of a hospital ever being built, yet some of my patients needed a place to stay for a short time for observation or ongoing treatment. Accordingly, in 1875, I opened a small hospitalium adjacent to my home. The local newspaper described me as charitable and benevolent, but I felt it was necessary. My time with you is rapidly coming to an end. But there was one more incident that I must recount. It involved Prince Alfred, the second son of our great Queen Victoria, and his visit to Colac. When it became known that the Prince would pass through our town during the royal visit of 1867, the Shire Council enthusiastically took the matter in hand. I was a member of the organising committee. It would be a welcome that the Prince would never forget. William Wyndham, a local resident from an aristocratic family, took a leading role in planning the visit. Wyndham drilled a cavalcade of 200 horsemen daily. Their horses would wear the blue rosettes for the occasion. All the school children were taught to sing God Save the Queen, and a platform was erected near the Shire Hall for their performance. The Colac brass band was engaged to provide music. A large triumphant arch was constructed over the intersection of Murray and Queen Streets. Masses of ferns covered the arch with motors like Welcome to Colac, Hail Victoria, and Victoria the Good, worked in with roses and thistles and shamrocks. An Argus reporter referred to the arch as the best he had ever seen. Smaller arches adorned the main street. A grand display of fireworks was organised for the night. Aborigines from near and far were also invited as part of the entertainment. Mrs. Canane of the Victoria Hotel prepared a sumptuous luncheon for the royal party. The illuminated address was to be read at the council chambers, followed by the children singing the national anthem. The Prince spent the night before in Winchelsea, and the royal party were expected to arrive in Colac at around 10 o'clock on the morning of the 4th of December. Instead, he decided to stay on at Barwon Park and shoot rabbits, and didn't leave until 2:30. From an early hour, the whole town was astir. Men, women and children hastily made their way to the Shire Hall. Horsemen flew up and down the street, shouting their wild huzzahs. The whole of the inhabitants showing their loyalty by bursting into a condition of excitement and enthusiasm never before witnessed. By 10 o'clock, the town was ready. It seemed that the whole community had come out to welcome the Prince. The school children were on the platform ready to sing the national anthem. All the little girls in white dresses and blue sashes. The cavalcade was lined up each side of the road at Harker's Reserve, ready for the Prince to pass through, then escort his entourage to town. Everyone waited and waited in the blistering sun, the day being exceedingly hot, but the Prince came not. Word finally came that the Prince would not arrive before 3 o'clock. This had a most disastrous effect upon the morale of the horsemen. Some made their way to the Great Western Hotel, where they quenched their thirst. The royal party stopped in Birregurra, where the local postmaster read out an address. They then proceeded to Colac. By now the cavalcade, reduced by half, was at the Birregurra Bridge, where the Prince was met. They were under orders to escort the carriage in an orderly manner. His Royal Highness bowed in acknowledgement of the hearty cheer which greeted him, and the cavalcade fell in behind as they hastened towards Colac. The scene presented to the eye, as the royal party approached the bridge and rapidly neared the trysting place, was one which baffles description, and only those who witnessed the sight can have any idea of the state of affairs at that eventful moment. Men, women and children, all on the tiptoe of expectancy and exhibiting signs of being stirred to the very depths of their souls with enthusiasm, excitement, and loyalty to the British Crown in the person of the Queen's second son. How the poor little boys and girls kept their places in the broiling sun for so many long weary hours is a mystery. But now the Prince is under the archway, and as the President of the Shire Council commences to unroll the scroll, a hearty burst of cheers comes forth from the assembled thousands gathered around. But there was stunned silence. To the amazement and astonishment of everybody, the Prince has driven through without even stopping to draw rein. Neither the address, nor the children, nor the cheering, nor even the ladies were sufficient to make him stop in his mad gallop, which speed he kept up until he reached the hill, where he was to be a guest of the Robertsons. Some excited persons tore off their rosettes and stamped them in the dust, and others attempted to pull down the flags and decorations. All sides expressed regret and disgust at the Prince's conduct. The disappointment of the children was felt to be the worst feature of the whole affair. A deputation was sent to Robertson's, where they were introduced to the royal offender, who expressed his deep regrets at the mistake which had been made and explained that he had understood from His Excellency the Governor that the Colac address was to have been forwarded instead of personally presented. Later that evening, word was received that the Prince would accept the address at Robertson's. It was a generally expressed wish of the reception committee that under the circumstances the address should not be presented at all. And it never was. In my later years in Colac, I became too fond of hard liquor. It ruined my life and my good name. My work as a doctor, especially a young doctor, wore me out emotionally and physically. I believe this was the root cause of my behaviour. It also left me in debt to people, friends, who trusted me to repay them. In 1878, the debts became excessive, even after friends had gifted me a sizable amount in the years prior. When my dear wife Agnes was publicly named in the court process to address the debts, for my family's sake I moved to Colac to work, leaving Agnes and newborn and our other children behind. I died only a few months after leaving, and thanked the good folk of Colac who supported Agnes and the children. Colac is where I am buried, under a patch of dirt, in an unmarked grave, whilst here lies my wife, who died in 1914, having raised our children on her own. With your goodwill, I can now rest in peace. I was able to speak to you today because of a spark of consciousness made possible by the work of the Almost Forgotten Project. I leave you with a settled spirit and bid farewell to the words of that loved Scottish song, "Should old acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind, we'll take a cup of kindness yet for old Lang Syne." God bless.